All right, well, thank you all. I begin by praising my God and King and Savior, Jesus Christ, and praying that he might, by his Spirit, anoint my lips to present the truth of the gospel with clarity, free from error. Thank you to my good friend Yusuf Ismail for coming here and giving me this opportunity to talk to you guys and to discuss with him the public evidences for Christianity. Yes, that's right. Christianity is an evidence-based faith. I stand before you as one who is a Christian because I am persuaded by the evidence that Christianity is objectively true. And we're going to be discussing some of that evidence today in the category of historical apologetics. We're going to be addressing the question, are the Gospels that we find in our New Testaments based on the testimony of eyewitnesses? There's a number of different categories or lines of evidence bearing on this question. Because of the constraints of time this evening, I cannot do justice to all those categories of evidence, or even one of those categories of evidence. So I'm going to be giving a very short overview of some of the evidence bearing on this question. But the Gospels are based on credible eyewitness testimony and are substantially trustworthy, as shown by evidence such as undesigned coincidences, incidental allusions, unexplained allusions, expressive silence, the criterion of embarrassment, reconcilable variations, artless similarities, the principle of restraint, and difficult local knowledge. Now, obviously, I don't have time to talk about each of those. There's a whole lecture that could be given on each of these individual points. So for the purpose of our discussion this evening, I'm going to limit myself to three of those. We're going to discuss undesigned coincidences, incidental allusions, and unexplained allusions as evidence for the Gospels being substantially reliable and based on the testimony of eyewitnesses. So let's begin by discussing undesigned coincidences. Now you might at this point be wondering, well, what is an undesigned coincidence? Well, sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other or both were copied from a common source. For example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other. The two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And this is best explained by giving examples. So let me give you an example. Suppose that you are inventing a gospel story, and the setup for your miracle story is going to have to do with money and food. Now, which disciple might you pick to be involved in the setup for your miracle story? Well, you might say Judas Iscariot, because he was in charge of the money bag. Or you might say Matthew, the tax collector. Maybe he knew a thing or two about money, or someone like that. Now go over to John chapter 6 and verse 5. We have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And we read about Jesus. It says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Raises a question in the audience's mind. Why does Jesus speak to Philip here in particular? Why Philip? Philip is a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Why does he turn to Philip and ask this question? Let's go over to Luke's account. Luke also tells us about the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And in Luke chapter 9, he says, on their return, the apostles told him all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. And that's where the feeding of the 5,000 miracle takes place. Okay? Bethsaida, bear that in mind. Now let's go over back to John's Gospel. 6 chapters later, after John has told us about the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, John chapter 12, in a completely different context, we read about Greeks who wanted to see Jesus. And it says, these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, sir, we wish to see Jesus. So Philip, we learn, is from Bethsaida in Galilee, right? Now let's put the pieces together, gathered from those texts that we just read. Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all, okay? It just mentions he spoke to the disciples. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story. Only by putting them together, that's Luke 9 with John 6 with John 12, can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5. Because Philip's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread, okay? That is the type of pattern which is very unsurprising in a work of history and truth-telling, but is rather surprising if the account is being made up. But wait, there's more. There's also an account of this miracle in Mark 6. According to Mark 6, Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going." Bear that little phrase in mind. Many were coming and going, so it was very busy, and they had no leisure even to eat. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, about that green grass. In Palestine and Judea, the grass is not green, but it's brown throughout the entire year, except at a very narrow window of time, because of elevated levels of rainfall, at the Passover season in the spring. But we go over back to John 6:4, which doesn't mention the green grass, so the people coming and going, and we learn the Jewish Passover festival was near. Again, it dovetails, it interlocks in a way that points to truth. So what's the significance of this category of evidence then? Well, one undesigned coincidence might be an accident, like having two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fit together just by chance. But if we discover numerous undesigned coincidences crisscrossing the documents, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they're all just accidental. Let's take another example. In John chapter 12, we read about Jesus approaching Bethany with the 12, just before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And John is unique in that he gives us the fact that this actually happened 6 days before the Passover. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, and Jesus had raised from the dead. So they give a dinner for him there. And then he tells us that the following day he goes and rides into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, right? Now, Mark does not tell us this timestamp of this happened 6 days before Passover. That's only in John. But Mark does tell us about Jesus approaching Bethany. It says, when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied in which no one has ever sat. Untie it and bring it." So I'm going to suggest that we can actually find each of those 6 days in Mark's gospel, even though Mark does not give us that timestamp that we're given by John. Now, my argument here is going to assume that Jesus first came to Bethany the day before, possibly towards evening, and that this text is merely alluding to the fact that Bethany and Bethphage are close to Jerusalem, and mark the approach to Jerusalem and the approximate location from which Jesus sent his disciples to get the colt, okay? Because, remember, John says that actually they arrived in Bethany the night before, and then on the morning they went to get the colt and ride into Jerusalem. Now, let's support my working assumption then. So the events described in Mark 11 seem to begin early in the day, which is consistent with them having arrived in Bethany the night before. Look at all the things that have to happen. They fetched the donkey. You've got the triumphal entry. Mark says that Jesus entered the temple and looked all around in verse 11. Looked around at everything, okay? So, if John is correct, then Jesus enters Jerusalem how many days before Passover? 5. 5 days before Passover. Then let's then start counting from Mark. So when we get to Mark 11 verse 11, we read, Jesus entered Jerusalem, went into the temple. When he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So that would be the end of 5 days before Passover, if John is correct, right? Then we continue, verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and you got the cursing of the fig tree. That would now be 4 days before Passover. And then you've got the end of verse 19. When evening came, they went out of the city. End of 4 days before Passover. So now, as they passed by in the morning, now we're at 3 days before Passover. They saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then you get to Mark 13, you have the Olivet Discourse. And the Mount of Olives, where this took place, is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been there, been all day, and Bethany, where he's been staying. So we can assume that that's the evening. The end of 3 days before Passover. Then we get to chapter 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover. It calibrates perfectly, synchronizes perfectly with the Gospel of John in a way that points to truth and veracity. But there's far more evidence than that. Let's continue. Matthew chapter 10 gives us the names of the 12 disciples. And it puts them in pairs, curiously. says the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Why does Matthew pair them like that? The explanation is given in Mark's Gospel in chapter 6 and verse 7. Jesus called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. Only Mark has this detail. But Mark 3, which lists the disciples, does not group them into pairs, right? So you have, an interlocking, a dovetailing between the gospel narratives in a way that points to truth. Here's another example. Jesus, at his interrogation before Caiaphas, the chief priest, false witnesses step forward and they misrepresent Jesus' words. They twist what Jesus said. Mark 14:58, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Later, when Jesus is on the cross and the passers-by are mocking him and deriding him, they say, aha, you who would destroy the temple or rebuild it in 3 days. Right? Now notice that nothing in the Synoptic Gospels provides a pretext for this accusation. In fact, it's a really serious allegation. In first century Judea, destroying the temple is not something you make jokes about, right? It's a really serious allegation, but nothing in the Synoptics gives us any clue as to what Jesus actually said. It's kind of left hanging there. What did Jesus actually say? But we go over to John's Gospel in chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. After Jesus has cleansed the temple, the Jews said to Jesus, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up, speaking of his body. John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not as used as an accusation. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark here, give us the accusation, but not the original statement. So neither of these is copied from the other. And notice, by the way, what Jesus is saying here. He's saying his body is the dwelling place of God in the midst of his people. Just as the temple is where God dwelt in the midst of his people, so now Jesus' body is where God has come to dwell. And by the way, Jesus predicts his death here, something which Islam denies in Surah 4, verse 157. And so if he wasn't crucified, as Muslims think, he must be a false prophet because he predicted it ahead of time. Now, another example. Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. This raises 2 questions in the mind of the audience. Why is Herod talking about this matter to his servants? And secondly, how would Matthew know what Herod was saying to his servants, right? The answer is in Luke's Gospel, chapter number 8, a completely different context. Soon afterward, Jesus went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who'd been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna and many others who provided for them out of their means. In other words, one of Jesus' disciples, female disciples, was married to Herod's household manager. This then illuminates why in Matthew 14, Herod was having a conversation with his servants about Jesus, and why Matthew would come to know what Herod was saying to his servants. Another example, in Luke 23, first 5 verses, Jesus is before Pontius Pilate. And it says, the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him, you have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. What? He just claimed to be king of the Jews. Pilate, are you stupid? I find no guilt in this man. Really? We go over to John's Gospel in chapter 18 for the answer. Gives us the parallel account. So Pilate entered the headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say this about me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And then he goes on to say, "I find no guilt in him." So, in other words, Pilate hears Jesus' words, "My kingdom is not of this world," and he says, I see, Jesus. You're a harmless religious nutcase and can be safely ignored. I find no guilt in this man. You don't mean a literal physical kingdom. You mean a spiritual kingdom, a religious kingdom, right? So then that dovetails then with Luke's gospel and explains something which is otherwise rather strange. Another example, Jesus washes the disciples' feet. In Luke 22:27, we read about the Last Supper. And we read Jesus' words, "For who is the greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves." Now, what does Jesus mean by that phrase? To what could he be referring? Nothing in Luke gives us a clue. But John, chapter 13, tells us that, again at the same meal, Jesus laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. Only John records the event that makes sense of Jesus' statement in Luke. But why does Jesus wash their feet? The answer is in Luke 22:24. It says, "A dispute also arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest." Only Luke mentions the dispute that explains why Jesus gave them this object lesson in servanthood, right? Luke does not tell us about the foot washing, the object lesson. John tells us about the object lesson. Luke tells us about the cause for it. So let's go on to another category of evidence. This is the argument from incidental allusions in Scripture, which you could also call external corroborations, which are basically when you have an allusion incidentally in the Gospels, which is then illuminated or corroborated by some external secular source. Okay? It's like an undesigned coincidence, except between biblical narratives and secular sources as well. So, for example, in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22, remember when Jesus and Mary and Joseph were in Egypt because they had to flee because of King Herod the Great, who wanted to get Jesus dead. So they had to flee to Egypt. And then Herod learns that Herod the Great has passed away, which happened around 4 BC. And he's on his way back to Judea. And then in verse 22 it says, "But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee." Now, why was Joseph so afraid of Herod Archelaus? It's the one time we read of him in Scripture. Why was he so afraid of him? Presumably, it was quite a fair assumption to think that if Herod the Great was dead, then his son Herod Archelaus would be reigning in Judea. And yet he continues in that knowledge on his way back until he learns, it says, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea, and so he flees via the regions of Galilee instead. Now, why? The answer is found in Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian. In his Antiquities of the Jews, volume 17, he tells us that the domain of Herod the Great was divided among his sons, with Archelaus having authority in Judea, but not in Galilee, which was governed by his younger brother, Herod Antipas. We also know that Archelaus had acquired quite a bloody reputation. In Antiquities of the Jews, Flavius Josephus tells us that one of the last things that Herod the Great did before his death was to have some Jews executed brutally for having removed the Roman eagles from the Jewish temple because of the Jewish obsession with graven images. And Herod the Great found out who was responsible and had them executed. Then he passed away, and Herod Archelaus began to reign. The Passover rolled around, and there was an influx of Jews coming into Jerusalem for the festival. And there was an argument struck up between the Jews and some of the Roman soldiers. The Jews picked up stones and they stoned the soldiers, and some of them died. And then they picked up their sacrifices and ran into the Jewish temple. Herod Archelaus was enraged at this threat upon his government. He then marshaled his entire armies and sent his army upon the Jewish temple. He surrounded the temple with the cavalry, told them, do not let anyone leave or enter the temple. He sent the infantry into the temple. He told them, massacre everyone you find. They killed 3,000 Jews that day. Then he announced, Passover is cancelled. Return to your homes. And so you can imagine Joseph on his way back from Egypt, coming to Judea, encountering this massive fleeing pilgrims coming out of Judea, hearing what just happened, and thinking, maybe it's not a good idea to go to Judea this time, right? And so then it illuminates for us the biblical narrative in a way that points to truth. Another example. Mark's gospel tells us about the execution of John the Baptist under Herod Antipas. According to Mark 6:27, Herod Antipas sent a military officer, the Greek term there is speculatora, to execute John the Baptist. Now, why use a military officer rather than a civil executioner? The answer is found in Flavius Josephus again. Herod, it turns out, was at war at the time with his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans, after he had divorced his daughter to marry someone else, and she had gone squealing home to daddy, and there had been a war broke out, the border wars between Herod Antipas and Aretas IV. This explains why he had a military officer carry out the execution. He was at Machaerus on a military campaign at the time, not at home in his palace in Galilee. Okay? Another example. Mark 10, verse 12. Jesus gives his teaching on divorce and remarriage. And he says, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he becomes an adulterer. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, there's a problem here. Jewish law made no provision. Jewish law made a provision for a man to divorce his wife, but not for a woman to divorce her husband, right? So there was no provision in Jewish law for a woman to divorce her husband. And yet Jesus says, if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now here, many critical scholars have said, well, actually, this shows us that Mark was a Gentile who here betrays his ignorance of Jewish law, or perhaps, alternatively, he's deliberately fudging and changing Jesus' teaching to make it relevant for a Roman audience. For example, John Donahue and Daniel Harrington, in their commentary on Mark's Gospel, say, and I quote, this sentence is generally regarded as an addition to Jesus' teaching that was made to address situations related to Roman legal practice, whereby a woman could initiate divorce proceedings. However, when we go over to Flavius Josephus, our old friend once again, he has some illumination to give us. He tells us in Antiquities of the Jews, volume 18, that Herodias, that was the woman that Herod married, took it upon herself to confound the laws of her country and divorced her first husband in order to marry Herod Antipas. Now, where was Herod Antipas tetrarch? He was tetrarch of Galilee, the very place where Jesus was giving this teaching. So again, you have this illumination from external secular sources corroborating the biblical narratives. But let's talk about another category of evidence bearing on the reliability of the New Testament Gospels. Unexplained allusions in Scripture. An unexplained allusion is where you have superfluous detail given that's not relevant to the story and is not explained or elaborated upon further. Now, if you're making up a story, you want to minimize unnecessary details. But when we read the Gospels, we actually find loads of cases of unexplained allusions, which is another hallmark of truth, I would argue. So, for example, in Mark 15 and verse 21, speaking about Jesus carrying his cross to Golgotha, where he is to be executed, it says, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Who are Alexander and Rufus? The Gospels don't tell us. Now, clearly there were people that were known to the original audience, but we don't know who they were today. Now, presumably, this is almost an invitation for the original audience to go and check this. Say, Alexander, Rufus, did your father, Simon of Cyrene, carry the cross for Jesus to the execution site? Why just name drop Alexander and Rufus without any explanation or reason, unless you're actually reporting true things? Another example is in Mark 3. And Simon, Jesus surnamed Peter, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is sons of thunder. So he renames James and John, the sons of Zebedee, sons of thunder. Why? No explanation given. Not relevant to the story, no explanation given. Again, points to truth. Another example is in John 2 in verse 12. After this, Jesus went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days, and that's all that's said of it. No further elaboration, not relevant to the story, no explanation. Another example is in John 3, where it says, "And now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification, and they came to John and said to him, 'Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing and all are going to him.'" Well, what does that have to do with purification? I mean, it just throws in that detail that we're having a debate over purification, and then they go to to John the Baptist, to say something completely irrelevant. Another example of that is in John 12, where the Greeks at Passover want to see Jesus. And these Greeks come to Philip, who's from Bethsaida in Galilee, and ask him, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." And Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit," and so on. And you're left wondering, what did the Greeks want to ask Jesus about? No explanation or elaboration given. So I want you to think about the material that we've gone over this evening in terms of this iceberg, with the iceberg representing all the material that there is to study on the evidences for the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. That's what we've covered today. Just a very small fraction of the evidences for the Gospels being based on eyewitness testimony. There's tremendous more evidence that could be discussed, and we might get into more later. But for each of these categories of evidence I went through, I could give a lecture for hours on example after example, demonstrating that the Gospels are indeed based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and that they are substantially reliable reports concerning the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So the conclusion then that I want to draw is that there is an avalanche or a tsunami of varied cumulative evidence that demonstrates that the Gospels and Acts are based on the testimony of eyewitnesses and that they are substantially trustworthy. And therefore, we must take seriously the statements in the Gospels and Acts concerning the resurrection also to come from apostolic testimony. And remember, what does Acts say? The resurrection appearances, Jesus appeared over a period of 40 days. It wasn't just one brief and confusing episode. He gave many convincing proofs to the disciples that he was alive. According to all four Gospels, the resurrection appearances were multi-sensory, that is polymodal, involving not just physical sight, but group sightings, group conversations, eating breakfast with, physical contact with, touching. The best explanation, I put it to you, for those accounts is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. That these reports go back to the testimony of the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. We also have the book of Acts. Acts was written by a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. And the book of Acts was written by someone who had access to the living witnesses concerning Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He was present in Jerusalem in Acts 21 with Paul. He describes himself as present when he uses the personal plural pronoun we from verse 16 onwards. He was a traveling companion of Paul. He was with Paul in Jerusalem, right where the treasure trove of living witnesses to Jesus' resurrection was located. He was present with Paul in prison in Caesarea for 2 years, which is close to Jerusalem. And he traveled with Paul from that region on the way to Rome and encountered shipwreck. So Luke had access to the living witnesses of the resurrection. And so we have the gospel authors were either themselves witnesses to Christ's resurrection and Christ's life and death, or they were people who had access to people who were. And so then I put it to you that we should embrace the Gospels as reliable reports of Jesus' life. And that we should embrace the conclusion that necessarily, or is the best explanation of the accounts pertaining to the resurrection. That yes, Jesus really was crucified, contrary to the Quran. He predicted his death ahead of time, and that he demonstrated his divine and messianic credentials by raising himself bodily from the dead. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.